Let me start by welcoming all of you, and in particular, welcoming Helen to ODI. This is actually a very special occasion for two, well, for many reasons, but for two in particular. One, because you're here to talk on something, of great concern to all of us. But secondly, because this is the inaugural moment for our new conference facility. So you are the first person to deliver an address in our new, improved conference facility. So welcome for that. Just to introduce Helen, who I think really needs no introduction, but Helen has been administrator of UNDP since 2009, which is actually the year I left UNDP, which is purely coincidental, I hasten to add, and also chair of the UN Development Group. And I think in that capacity has really played a leading role in the debate on the framing of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also thinking about the financing and the delivery mechanisms. Before that, as many of you will know, Helen was Prime Minister of New Zealand for almost a decade. And I think, there were two notable features actually of your time as Prime Minister, which is one, the general performance of New Zealand in many areas of economic growth and social development, but I think in particular the commitment that you brought to addressing the problems of the most marginalised sections of New Zealand society, and I think that's something you've really brought to into the UN system as well. We're here, I think, because for all of us we recognise the critical importance of 2015, and actually last week we had Mary Robinson with us. And as you know, Mary has these, moments of profound insight. And one of the observations that she made was that she said this is almost the Bretton Woods moment for our generation. It's the year that we're coming together to define our collective ambition for the next 15 years. But also it's the year that we're coming together to put in place the financing mechanisms needed to achieve the ambition and to tackle the enormous risks that will come with climate change. And it seems to be, just from an ODI take on this, we have various teams that are working, as you know, in areas that are very relevant for this. But, I think the smart money is clearly on us adopting what will be very ambitious goals. They could be more concise in some areas, but the eradication of poverty, the elimination of avoidable child deaths, universal secondary education in 15 years. This is not a small ask, and I think it's important to recognise that, and also to recognise that on our current trajectory, we're not going to get there. If business as usual will not take us to where we need to be. We'll miss the eradication of poverty margin by a big number. We miss the child mortality by around 4 million child deaths. We've stalled on primary education, let alone achieving universal secondary education. So I think the Addis moment is an opportunity to take a long, hard look at where we are in relation to where we want to get. And in particular to do, what you did in New Zealand, which is to look at people who are being left behind and at the special conditions and the mechanisms that need to be put in place to tackle that, but also to look ahead to Paris and I think to join up the summit circuit, as it were, because if we get Addis wrong, it's going to create all sorts of difficulties in terms of the progress towards getting an ambitious deal in Paris. And contrariwise, if something very tangible and ambitious comes out of Addis, I think that's going to create a renewed momentum towards Paris. So there are real opportunities and real risks. The format, Helen, is basically you're going to deliver the keynote and your reflections on where we are, where we're going, the processes, and some of the substantive issues behind them. We're then going to have a question and answer session. So over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Kevin and ODI, for hosting this, and thank you everyone for being here and being in cyberspace and taking an interest. There's been such a huge civil society, NGO, governmental, all aspects of British society interest in the post-2015 process, and I guess that's reflected in the sort of interest you always attract around one of these events. And yes, I'm very much of the view that 2015 is the big year in development because of these major events which all interlock and give us a chance to get global agendas hopefully consistent and coherent across them, which do deliver inclusive development, sustainable development, resilient development. I mean, this would be a wonderful outcome. And then, of course, there's the implementation. The outcome's one thing, but actually making it happen. And as you say, business unusual. Otherwise, we end up in 2030 with still people living in with as little dignity as many live in today, which is a huge issue. So I see it as the year of the 4 major processes and 4 major summits associated with them. But let's also remember that it is the 20th anniversary of Beijing Plus 20 and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So that's a timely reminder to us to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment run right through the new agenda as well. So this series of summits, and all have had long processes leading up to them, start in Sendai in northeastern Japan, obviously location of the devastating Great Northeast Japan tsunami of 2011. And that is the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Very much plays into the resilience agenda. It's for the weather events, it's the other side of the coin from climate change adaptation. We're talking disaster risk reduction, we're talking adaptation around climate risk. And of course, sustainable development has to be sustained development, not knocked back every time there's a major hazard materialises. So we think it's a very important conference. And then, as you rightly emphasise, this 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development in Addis is critical. Indeed, the sequence of negotiations for the post-2015 outcome in September is that each month from January to June, there will be 3 days of negotiations. The process will then go on the pause button until after the Addis conference, because the means of implementation part of the outcome document for September won't be able to be sealed, settled, advanced until after Addis produces. So Addis is a critical conference. I'll talk a little about that. We're all very familiar with, obviously, the SDG summit at head of government, head of state level in September. And then, as Mary would have fully reminded you last week, I mean, the climate summit is just such an indispensable part of all this. Climate change we see as one of the biggest threats to sustained and sustainable development. And every cent that's raised for adaptation and mitigation in developing countries is money for development. So, it's something we're very, very focused on supporting our program countries with. So if we took then as our theme, well, what will success look like in 2015? It would be, as I say, a great outcome across 4 processes that was consistent, all boats moving in the same direction. And not so easy to achieve, because at governmental level, I know that at Sendai we'll see the emergency response and civil defence ministers. In Addis, we may see finance ministers. In the September summit, we'll see development ministers with leaders. And at the Paris summit, we'll see the climate change and environment ministers, which means in bureaucracies around the world, there's different silos working on each of these. And it really needs a whole of government, leader of government-led process in country to get coherent outcomes across them. But certainly at UNDP, and I know at ODI, you take the overview, so we've got to get these processes knitted together. So in the negotiations, these 3 days a month for the first 6 months, what they're working on is 4 elements of the outcome. The first will be the political declaration or vision, if you like, the sort of 2015 version of the Millennium Declaration. And that's an important piece of wording to negotiate, because it sets ambition and the transformational nature of the agenda. Then there's the goals and targets aspect. Then there's the means of implementation to be settled post-ADIS. And then there's the issue of monitoring and review and accountability. So these are the areas they want to produce for the outcome document. Now, clearly, it's basically on track to be an agreement, an outcome which is universal, applying as much to the United Kingdom as it does to Haiti in its reach, and covering all the strands of sustainable development, the economic, social, and environmental. And with the goal 16 introducing the language around peaceful and inclusive societies, effective, accountable and responsive institutions, access to justice, rule of law, tackling corruption, there I think you really get to the heart of some of the issues which on business as usual would not see us eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. So really addressing some of the underpinnings of what is needed to advance and lock in development progress. Now, it's certainly my sense that the member states are going to be reluctant to open up the open working group outcome much. They see a lot of the legwork on the outcome document having been done in that. In the process of the negotiation of the open working group, in the end, no one would give up their goal if others didn't give up theirs. So in a sense, there's something for everything, which is both a challenge and an opportunity, if you like, and I can come back to that. But not anticipating that there would be significant change there. Obviously, finishing the unfinished business of the MDGs is very much top of the agenda for many of us, and there is quite a lot of it. But it's always been important that the agenda went much further than that. And you see coming through some of the major conferences on development around the UN the last 3 to 4 years, like the Istanbul conference for the LDCs, and then the one in Vienna last year for the landlocked developing countries and for the SIDS. They are, very much preoccupied with jobs and growth. And of course the issue in a sustainable development agenda is jobs and growth in a sustainable development context, so that we don't end up wrecking the global commons in the quest for growth as the traditional path has been. So it is and always was going to be a much bigger agenda than the MDGs. More transformational, but the fact that it's bigger also means there's more room to pick and choose for countries as to what they focus on. And I think there'll need to be a lot of ongoing advocacy beyond 2015 to see that critical parts of the agenda don't fall by the wayside. It's very easy for sexual and reproductive health or women's empowerment to fall by the wayside. This must not happen. We could say that the MDGs, in a way, were a commitment to tackle poverty in a number of its manifestations, backed up by official development assistance. But the sustainable development agenda is really about the way we live, produce, consume, do business, do everything. So by its nature, it's a much bigger, broader and more complex agenda. The Secretary-General's report, a synthesis report which appeared Christmas, early January period, didn't challenge the open working group outcome of the 17 goals and the large number of targets, but rather said, don't forget what Rio Plus 20 said, that the goals should be limited in number and measurable. And he offered the concept of 6 elements or organising principles into which you might organise the goals as a way of, sort of structuring it, if you like. And obviously, 6 is easier for people to remember than 17. I would be challenged to cite 17, but as an organising, shaping, framing principle, I think that elements approach has some considerable merit, although it's not yet clear whether that will get traction in the negotiations. Secretary-General also offered the technical support of the UN system in addressing the targets, because at the moment not all the targets are measurable and some are more political statements. Now again, it remains to be seen whether the system will be called on in the course of the negotiations to help refine and make more measurable those targets. And then after the agenda hopefully is finalised and sealed in September, there's implementation, and no point in strong vision statements, goals and targets if there's not consideration given to the implementation. We see, as compared with the MDGs, which were a lot about generating the necessary resources to tackle entrenched poverty in a range of dimensions. This agenda, of course, money is important, but also so are some hard policy choices important about what's prioritised. And to achieve this agenda, there will need to be policy shifts, there may need to be regulatory shifts. If you take, for example, right now, could there be a better time for removing energy subsidies? If you want to, work across the strains of sustainable development, energy subsidies going is quite important, providing, of course, the mitigation is put in place for the poorest households who've got the cheaper fuel. And we all know that most of the money doesn't go on them anyway from the subsidies, but if you're going to remove them, you certainly can't leave poor people with unaffordable fuel. When I say shifts in policy, if there's going to be a serious attempt to tackle inequality, that's not going to happen just by lifting a growth rate. It has to be the result of deliberate policies that tackle inequality. And again, universal basic services, social protection, a commitment to jobs. This is extremely important in that. So if we come to the money side, then we come to the Addis conference. And what I think is critical about Addis is of course, that it reaffirms the 0.7 ODA target, and I understand there's still some debate about that in European circles. Let me just say how critical it is for getting a strong outcome in September that Europe sticks to the 0.7 target. It's really an article of faith, I think, with developing countries. But clearly, the level of investment that is needed for sustainable development cannot be done off ODA. I mean, that would be a ridiculous thing to suggest. If you look, for example, at total ODA going into Africa each year, what are we talking, 40, 50 billion? But the sustainable development investment needs for Africa are going to run into the trillions, in the time frame of this new agenda. So it's not going to come off ODA. The ODA can be very important, very catalytic in generating the capacities for the governance, the rule of law, the enabling environment, the regulation, which makes the growth of the economy possible, the domestic resource mobilisation, the trade, the investment. But inevitably, some of those other sources of finance, what a country can raise itself, and the investment it can attract, are going to be extremely important. But I think at Addis also, it's important to put on the agenda the issue of the global trade rules, because that governs how a country grows and develops. There's the issue of the illicit financial flows, which are draining a number of countries of money that's not then available for good development purposes. There's the international tax regimes. These are issues which have been coming up at G7/8 and G20, but they're important issues to register. And then the whole issue of climate finance, because as I said earlier, if there's money raised for adaptation for developing countries or for mitigation, this is sustainable development and resilience building money. So I think that Addis will need to have quite a broad and rational discussion about what it will take to finance the new agenda and what the range of sources are. And then we also feel at UNDP that it should be mindful of supporting countries to strategise around and deal with risk. You know, globalisation brings exposure to greater volatility, uncertainty and unpredictability. And we're living in a particularly acute phase of all this at the moment. Can it be a coincidence that when I go to Davos tomorrow, the theme for it is the new global context: volatility, unpredictability, uncertainty. I mean, we live with this. And how to protect countries and communities from being overexposed, I think, is quite a big issue. You know, risk governance. How do countries look at their economic risk? You know, the issues of diversification, social protection, protecting those who fall through the cracks of some of these changes and events, etc. So risk, I think, also needs to be thought of beyond the economic risk, exacerbated by globalisation as it is, into the risk of epidemic. And what, more ghastly example could we have of how disease can imperil development than what has happened in the three most affected countries in West Africa, which were in GDP terms among the fastest growing in the world, and that was all knocked sideways by disease, which couldn't be contained, lack of infrastructure capacity and so on. And a classic case of where, you know, a stitch in time saves nine. The upfront investment to stop Ebola would have been a fraction of what is now costing in economic terms and of course human life loss. And then that kind of leads on to a couple of the other risk areas. Risk area around conflict. Do we invest enough up front in the peace architecture, in the tolerance, in the community building, in education, in a number of the things which might, you know, act to prevent communities flying apart under stress, to say nothing of investment in political systems which are more responsive. And then that leads into the risk around the natural disasters and the focus of Sendai. You know, with a growing population, we have many more of the world's people living in places which are highly exposed to risk. And with some of what's happened with our forest cover, our settlement, very exposed areas of sea coastlines, a major natural disaster comes along these days has the prospect of killing a lot of people. So investment in this area, and we conventionally say $1 invest in disaster risk reduction will save 7, is pretty important. For the Sendai conference, the message we'll bring is that risk-blind development exacerbates vulnerabilities, that disasters set back development for years. Of course, with the recovery phase, you aim to build back better so that it won't happen in quite the same way again. It's going to be rather interesting to, in the aftermath, the immediate response to these terrible floods in Malawi and Mozambique, to compare the two experiences, because Mozambique has had quite a lot of investment and work done on disaster risk reduction. Malawi, it hasn't been the same, so perhaps to compare and learn from the two experiences and reinforce the importance in Malawi of prioritising this will be important. So we'll be talking about comprehensive risk governance through these kinds of events. And then to the climate change conference in Paris, we see climate change very much as a subset of the Sustainable Development Challenge. It's one of a number of the planetary boundaries at risk of being breached and seriously breached. And let us follow the scientific evidence on this. You know, it's not fantasy. It's based on pretty hard scientific material now. You know, unmitigated climate change is a disaster for all of us, obviously for the poorest countries, but You know, I look at the news in the UK and the Somerset levels last year and think, you know, hello, you know, a whole new level of resilience needs to be built. But what can we do around greenhouse gas emission reduction, which might make a difference for the longer term as well? I think in the information or assessments that UNEP is producing, they're still not seeing in the level of ambition and commitments countries are making enough to deliver a temperature rise under 2 degrees Celsius. And we were always told that above 2 degrees was disastrous. So 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 is doubly, trebly disastrous. So we need a lot more ambition yet in that process. Just maybe briefly on some of the accountability issues and implementation issues. The UN development systems run a kind of secondary round of consultations still going on around what we've called soft means of implementation, which is the non-money means. And the consultation streams have run across the vital role of local government, vital role of effective institutions which are open, you know, to people's ideas, participation, etc. The broader participatory monitoring we think is going to be very important. The full and meaningful engagement of civil society. And let's put in brackets there's been a lot of talk about a data revolution so that what's happening against the SDGs can be monitored, evaluated, reviewed. But then, you know, civil society needs capacity and you know, upskilling to do that too, and space in which to work, and that space has been receding in quite a lot of countries, which is not the way we like things to go. We have been looking at what the private sector role could be, and the role of culture, heritage and values. I mean, post-2015 won't be a treaty, so it's not binding. But there is so much interest in this that I think countries should consider themselves bound and know that they are going to be monitored, watched, evaluated by the world's citizens. And then one has to consider what would be the global mechanisms. Some of the targets will relate across to other international commitments which have their monitoring and review targets. But is there to be something under the high-level political forum on sustainable development? Will the ECOSOC mechanism for national voluntary reporting on the MDGs be transformed towards this? You know, these are all important issues for discussion. And just perhaps a very last word on the UN system. My constant refrain to the constituents of the UN Development Group is that sustainable development requires whole-of-government approaches. Therefore, if the UN system is to be helpful with sustainable development, it has to be whole-of-UN approaches, rather than everyone running off from their own silo to a ministry that matches that silo. So it's also a good incentive for us to continue our work to be rather more joined up internally and working collaboratively around the sustainable development agenda, because the answers to complex questions never lie in one agency, one sector, one ministry, one set of interests. They lie in how you can draw the strengths and expertise from across sectors and silos. Thank you, Kevin.
Helen, thank you for that amazing overview, actually, because these are incredibly complicated processes and you really brought them together. I was very struck, actually, by your points on risk and resilience, because you know there's so much evidence now that if you look at what really sets people back at a household level, like a single drought can take you from just above the poverty line to just below the poverty line for a decade, you know, where you rebuild your assets. And what's true for people is also true for whole countries. So those flood events that you mentioned in Malawi have the potential to... What I wanted to do, Helen, if I may, is Tom Mitchell, who heads our climate and environment program here and is very centrally involved in preparations and thinking about the disaster risk reduction conference. So Tom, could I call on you?
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, Tom Mitchell. I head the Climate Change Environment Programme here at ODI. And I have been working quite a lot in the lead up to Sendai. And Helen, thank you very much for your comments on Sendai. I think you opened talking about kind of coherence. And I wrote a blog recently saying, well, Sendai is an opportunity to test whether or not we're heading down a route of coherence. And we received the latest text on Thursday, I think, after the latest round of negotiations. And you can only look at it and think, well, are we setting out on the right track? You know, climate change mentioned in a kind of scant way. The word conflict in a 17-page agreement mentioned just once and in square brackets in the draft text. Poverty mentioned 3 times and not talking directly about links between disaster risk reduction and poverty eradication in any depth. You know, monitoring mechanisms and the linkages to SDGs, you know, very barely mentioned. And so, you know, you can't really look at the document as it stands at the moment and feel hugely elated about the opportunity for coherence. And I just wondered whether you had some perspective on why it's been difficult for government so far to find the language and expressions of, you know, particularly also in terms of means of implementation of how to drive that coherence. And just secondly, I was really interested that you finished on talking about UN system coherence and an all of UN approach and an all of government approach. Yet we have UNISDR, you know, shaping this process around Sendai quite significantly, and yet UNISDR, not a member of the UN Development Group, as I understand it, not a member of the IASC on the humanitarian side, a secretariat, you know, arguably a little bit weakly soft-funded, and yet, you know, a part of the UN system quite squarely behind one of the key processes, without, you could argue, the necessary ammunition or maybe even mandate and positioning within the UN system to really drive that perspective forward that you talked about as kind of risk-aware development. So on those two dimensions, it would be good to get your commentary.
Thanks, Tom. So I guess it's two questions in one really. One about overall coherence of the framing, and secondly, the sort of institutional coherence questions.
Well, as I said, it's partly that the people in governments back in capitals focused on Sendai will be in emergency response, disaster risk kind of ministries, and if there's not strong across government coordination across these processes, there'll be a kind of siloed approach. But if I turn it around the other way, the Open Working Group was quite good on bringing disaster risk reduction into the SDG framing. So in a sense, if the Sendai text can't be improved, then there's still the opportunity to play it back through the SDGs. It may be that on climate change they've been a little bit bemused, as it were, in the same way the Open Working Group was with climate change, because you've got a treaty negotiation process going on in a UN treaty secretariat-led process. And to what extent do you then import that negotiation, as it were, into Sendai, because you're not negotiating a climate agreement at Sendai and you're not negotiating it in the SDGs. But I understand that with the SDG discussion, the member states, having been concerned about not importing it, are actually seeing now, acknowledging now, that not to have strong references to climate would make the SDG agenda look suboptimal. So you know, the chances are that it will be well cross-referenced. But I mean, clearly to all of us in this room, we see that disaster risk reduction with weather events has a great deal to do with climate change. So, you know, again, there needs to be some consistency here. On the ISDR, you see, the ISDR is like a convention secretariat, you know, like the one for the Montreal Protocol or the Convention on Biological Diversity and so on. ISDR actually sits headed by an Assistant Secretary General reporting to the Under Secretary General who heads OCHA, Valerie Amos. So it's not seen as an organisation in its own right. OCHA is its home and base, and OCHA then will be expected to represent its interests. But also going back to the previous World Conference, you had the Secretariat function, but then you had UNDP given a significant implementing function. And yes, we are, of course, doing our best to be across it, but you know, I certainly take your point that the wording will need some improvement yet, and we need to be supporting member states to raise the concerns about this.
Could I just, before I throw it open to questions, I just wanted to call on Lenny Wild, who's another ODI researcher working on a lot of the what are the central themes for this year.
Many thanks, Kevin. So I'm Lenny Wild. I head up a team at ODI looking at the politics of public goods and service delivery. And a lot of your comments really resonated with me, particularly around the need to think about the hard policy choices and the implementation issues for post-2015 in a way that perhaps wasn't at the forefront of minds when the MDGs were first being agreed. I think what's interesting, if you look at the evidence, we know actually there's still pretty mixed evidence about what it really takes to create the institutions, the systems that can support that kind of hard policy choice and prioritisation, particularly for the poorest. And the efforts to support government reforms, changes in government policies by external actors also have a mixed track record here. And I'm part of an initiative, a broader initiative that's calling for us to do things quite differently in relation to particularly these kinds of institutional and governance questions. It's calling for approaches which aren't trying to bring in international best practice, but to really start with countries where they are and think about how in politically smart and savvy ways you get them to move forward on some of these questions. And I wondered if you could give us your reflections on how you see UNDP's role in supporting some of these hard policy making and policy choices going forwards, and whether there are things that you'd like to see UNDP or perhaps others do differently as well.
I guess that's an important starting point for any forward-looking process is to look back and ask ourselves what's gone well and what's gone badly.
Well, I think it points to the difference between the agenda we've had and the emerging agenda, I think, because, as I said, in a way the MDGs were based on the assumption that if you threw enough money at these problems, you'd get a result. So schooling, healthcare, income poverty, etc. And yet you can't get all the way just with money, even if you've got it, right? If your laws are discriminatory, if the government's capacity is not there to plan, implement, deliver, etc. And I think if the SDG agenda can be made to stick with a focus on inequalities and leaving nobody behind, this is very much about addressing marginalisation, discrimination, inequity, unequal opportunity. So, these are policy issues that not every country now might be, that comfortable with discussing. But to really make the breakthrough, some of the areas that have got to be confronted. So, you ask, well, what can we do? What do we do? We see ourselves very much in the business of being a facilitator of knowledge of what has been done elsewhere to tackle similar problems and challenges, and provide the menu of options that people might adapt and create something relevant for their own society. And South-South cooperation, I think, is extremely helpful in this regard, because many countries in the South are very interested in what others who've addressed the same challenges have been able to do to overcome them. On some of the other hard policy choices, as I say, like energy subsidies, I think we can be part of sharing the experiences of how countries did it without, undermining the position of the poor. I think myself that if you abolish energy subsidies, you release a vast amount of money, which would enable you to introduce a form of social protection which is very helpful, and still leave you cash over for investment in clean infrastructure of various kinds. So it's a no-brainer in a sense if countries are prepared to take the hard political choice to stare down perhaps elements of the business community and private sector who've been getting a free good for quite a long time.
Thanks, Helen. Actually, I think the recent experience in Indonesia really underscores what you're saying. That you've got a government that has really dramatically cut subsidies back, released revenues for investment in social protection, health, and education. So, look, before I throw it over for questions, I'm not going to abuse the chair by saying positive things about ODI research, but I will say that Lenny's part of a team actually that has looked at some of these experiences and prospects for achieving some of the goals that are set out. And it's very striking that if you look beneath the national averages and look at what's happening to the poorest and sanitation, water, education, you're not talking about 2030 to reach the targets. You're talking about 2090 or beyond. And I think this really goes to the heart of questions about how do we frame policies and financing to reach the most marginalised, which is where you started actually, and I think really central to the debate. So with that, what I want to do now is I'm going to take questions in groups of 3, and I'm hoping the questions will be relatively short, and that the questioners will say who they are before they ask the question.
I'm Rob Yates from Chatham House, and it really just to build on that last point you were making about joining up agendas, and this particular one about reducing fuel subsidies to pay for rapid health and education reforms. And this would appear to be happening, as Kevin's mentioned, it's happening in Indonesia, where President Jokowi is handing out these cards, specifically linking it to reducing fuel subsidies. It's also happening in Iran as well. And I was just wondering to chat about our role in getting these messages through to political leaders, because it's as much the politics of this, being able to replace a popular subsidy for something sensible as you take away a silly subsidy like energy revenues. But we don't seem to be very good at selling the political benefits, and I just wonder how we can improve on that.
Hopefully you weren't receiving fuel subsidies as indicated by your card there. Hopefully you weren't receiving the fuel subsidies. Please, in the front row here.
Thanks. I'm Ken Bluestone. I work with Age International. We're the UK affiliate of the Help Age Global Network. Looking back, looking forward, one of the things that was not actually part of the MDGs and the scene was a recognition of the intergenerational nature, basically, of development. Very optimistic in that there is clearly a discussion going on now, but I wanted to get your thoughts about how realistic it is really to embed a multi-generational understanding of development in the next framework going forward. And in that respect, how realistic are these ambitions around leave no one behind to achieve?
Thank you. Question right here.
Thank you. Barkha from Mauritius. I'm also part of the Global Shapers community of the World Economic Forum. And my question may perhaps link to Lenny's question. So last year, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk report saw lack of leadership as one of the biggest systemic risks for our future economies. So I just was wondering, where do we expect to find leadership to make difficult decisions on financing, on managing different actors? Is it government? Is it the youth? Is it the private sector? Where do we expect leadership on 2015 targets to be found? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm actually going to take one more short question right here.
Helen, thank you very much. That was a wonderful roundup of everything you do. My name is Geeta. I work for World Vision. I have 2 short questions. One of them is conflict. Thank you very much for benchmarking it. It has been observed by a lot of people and talked about it in many, many conferences. It's the linchpin for lots of other things to come through, like education, health, water and sanitation and all that stuff. But it is also the focus area that has always been shaky. And we weren't very sure it was going to be in the synthesis report. It is there because Open Working Group wasn't opened. And there is, again, the chance of it falling through. I wanted to get your reading in terms of what's happening at the UNGA level and your level in terms of how to keep it on. And the second question is accountability. It seems to be a massive monster in that sense. The accountability for MDGs have been quite straightforward. The member states reported what they wanted to feel like, and this time it's different. And if you're looking at regional reporting system, how that would work. Are we thinking of creating a new system? If we are, that is going to be so monstrous, who's going to fund it and how it will work, just to get a sense of your thoughts.
Thanks. So Helen, I guess there are two broad questions about the politics. One as Rob raised in the context of the Indonesian example about national political coalitions and national and global leadership. And I guess in the end, this is what it comes down to, that without it, things don't move. So maybe if you want to start with those.
Well, I think the point Rob raised around the fuel subsidies, and we now have good examples of countries which have removed and have made the political case, I can do X and Y if I don't have to subsidise that. All of us in development need to be in the business of sharing the ideas and convening the kinds of meetings with the key decision makers which will drop that seed, if you like. I think the Minister of Finance meetings around the margins, the World Bank IMF meetings twice a year, a good chance to do that. And the banks and the IMF actually both been very strong on the importance of this as a move. So, we're certainly in full cry behind that, as are a number of others. So, I just think sharing the experiences, the knowledge exchange, making sure that those who are looking at going down that track see the ways to do it. I mean, the way not to do it is to just announce it's being removed and have nothing to put in its place. That risks a huge pushback, as we saw when there was an announcement of that kind in one major country a couple of years ago. It just couldn't fly. There was a retreat. But it can be done well, and that needs to be shared. Secondly, on the intergenerational issues, I'm optimistic now that with much more emphasis on universal health coverage, universal social protection, that we start to get those intergenerational factors coming through, and very, very important for the world's elderly, of which there are fast-growing numbers in developing countries which have not in the past had pension systems and social protection and support for older people. So, keep advocating, I would say, because obviously we hear the voices of women, we hear the voices of youth, we have agencies, people devoted to these things in the UN system, but there hasn't been an agency, a voice, a flag up specifically for older people. So I think the NGO, civil society communities' voices is very important on keeping this intergenerational thrust coming through. On the leadership issue, well, what can we say? I mean, countries choose their leaders, according to their laws, constitutions, and ways of doing things. But yes, so much hangs on leadership. The poorest country, well led, can perform miracles. The richest country, badly led, can slip back. The leadership is critical, and government leadership matters, absolutely matters, at all levels. From the local community leader, the mayor, the regional provincial chief, to the national or federal government. It matters. I think there's plenty of other areas for leadership as well, and youth leadership, women's leadership, many areas. And on private sector leadership, yes, we need beyond rhetoric, beyond social responsibility, into some serious issues around value chain management and ways of doing things, which are very positive for development. Now, one of the things UNDP has been working very hard on the last year is the stream of action around forests for the climate change issues. And to the extent, I'm now told that out of the sort of coalition across governments, companies, CSOs, Indigenous peoples, constituencies, the private sector buyers of 95% of palm oil are now into the deforestation-free supply chain commitments by 2020. This is huge, and this is the sort of leadership we would like to see on a lot of issues. We now need, of course, to expand the commodities covered from palm oil to other forms of agriculture, etc., which destroy forests. But it is an example that leadership can play a critical role. There have been some private sector leaders who have really stepped up on that. In response to the World Vision question. Look, I think Goal 16, peaceful and inclusive societies, is going to stick. It's going to stick because basically the goals won't be seriously opened up again. And from perspective of UNDP, I mean, we would love to see Goal 16 stick and have some good targets and indicators. It's an important part of our work, and it always helps when your work is in a global agenda. But you know, we can't meet 2030 targets if countries risk being in the position of South Sudan or Central African Republic today in 2030. You can't take people out of extreme poverty or really make progress on anything else if you're dealing with something as fundamental as a crisis of that kind, or the Syria crisis, or a range of others which we could mention. And on accountability, I don't think, you know, anyone's necessarily envisaging some, you know, vast mega data central reporting system and so on. I think that the national voluntary reporting on the MDGs is actually quite a good process, and it is peer reviewed. So I think that could be adapted. But I also think that within each country we need accountability. And civil society is going to be critical for that. Parliaments are going to be critical for putting governments under scrutiny as to whether they are playing their part in achieving the goals that they will all have signed up to.
Thanks very much. So there's quite a few questions over here, actually. If you guys could keep the questions really reasonably short. Thank you.
Alistair Bradstock from IIED. I'd like to ask a finance question. You've spoken about the ambition that's required to deliver on the SDGs. Could you tell us whether you think there's going to be significant changes in the way ODA is allocated? Do you see a move to southern organisations, be they public as well as CSO, and how that might play out in the future?
Thanks. Next person.
Hi, I'm Susan Nicolai from ODI. You know, you're talking today about 2015 ambition, and I'm just wondering if you've got any particular thoughts on what will tell us if we've achieved that ambition when we hit January 1st, 2016. You know, what will be one or two things that would be key indicators or key tests that could tell us about that difference? And I'm going to sneak in one more question.
I'd rather you didn't actually, because there's a lot of other people waiting. Thanks.
Hi, Bob McMullen. I wanted to raise an issue that follows on from the ageing question, really, because it's another group that were left out of the MDGs, which is people with disabilities. They tend to be the poorest of the poor, people with disabilities in developing countries. And I really would welcome enhanced commitment to doing something about that in the SDGs and, of course, at Sendai and elsewhere, because they're also the most vulnerable in times of crisis.
Thank you. Right in the front here.
Nigel Peters from British Expertise. China's behind the setting up of two major new development institutions this year, the BRICS New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank. How do you see them working with the UN and buying into the general sustainable agenda?
Thank you. Mary, I'm sorry I'm cramming so many questions in, but I think there's a lot of people that really want to engage with you on this. So I guess two questions there on development finance, and clearly, you know, one of the big issues on development finance that, you know, a lot of the countries that encapsulate the starkest problems are not countries necessarily that are well served by the current financial architecture. And I guess by extension, the question, you know, will that to some degree provide a corrective?
Yeah, well, I think South-South cooperation is going to continue to grow. At this point, in terms of outright grant money, it's nothing like what Western ODA is providing, but it has potential to grow. It has under South-South cooperation also comes a lot of trade flows, soft loans, and so on, which countries obviously find valuable. But I think the source of financing will only continue to increase, and probably exponentially. There's one other issue to make about development assistance definitions, and that is that the OECD is still debating what its definition is going to be going forward. It's settled the issue, I think, of how to deal with conditional loans, which weren't concessional, which weren't concessional at all. But there's still issues lurking around as to whether countries can count their peacekeeping spending as an ODA, and I do hope they don't give in on that, because it all just enables people to say they've met 0.7 without spending a cent more on development. So I'm not for that. Secondly, the question about how would we define whether the agenda really is a transformational and ambitious one at the end of the year? To me, it's going to be partly about whether the way the whole agenda is framed goes beyond saying that we want to eradicate poverty, which we all do, without acknowledging that without peace, inclusion, reasonable governance, rule of law, there's not much chance of doing that. And without linking the eradication of poverty back into what's happening to our environment. Because the worse the environmental degradation, the worse the prospects for the world's poorest people. You can't eradicate poverty if the very means and sustenance of life is undermined. So for me, whether it's a transformational and successful agenda will depend on whether those dots are all being joined up. And poverty eradication is seen as really very dependent on some of these underlying factors being addressed. Totally agree with Bob McMullen on the disabilities issues. As with ageing, it wasn't specified, but I think again, if the approaches leave no one behind, inclusion, deal with inequalities, universal services, universal social protection, right to work, this can be seen as very inclusive of the people with disabilities. And then the last question, yes, very interesting developments on the financial institution creation beyond the Bretton Woods institutions and the regional development banks. And we could probably add a third one to your China list, because apart from the BRICS initiative, still not yet well defined, but for the point of view of developing countries, bring it on. I mean, everyone's interested in more financing for development. Then the one which could be seen as a competitor or a complement to the Asian Development Bank, depending on the way you think. And then there's also a proposal for something around the kind of Silk Road area as well. But, great. I mean, money for development. Countries are crying out for it. I'm all for it. And I think, there's plenty of opportunities to engage with China on how some of the ones that it's spearheading can develop. I do think that one of the critical problems in multilateralism at the moment is the inability to get the IMF quota reform. And the longer that impasse remains, the more I think we will start to see the creation of institutions outside the IFIs, because if the IFIs are not seen as responsive and representative, then people vote with their feet in effect. So I think there's some, canaries in the mind around some of these alternatives that are springing up. There's a bit of dissatisfaction about how to reform the 1945 institutions.
Especially on the government side.
Yeah.
I wanted to say we've actually got an online audience that rivals the afternoon showing of Neighbours or whatever it is that's on TV at the moment. And one of the questions that is coming from Gareth Wall, who works for the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, is asking really about whether the role of local government in transformation has been sufficiently recognised, and also in the context of the financing discussions around Addis. But maybe you could come back to that when.
Sure.
So now I'm going to go this way, right?
Well, Carl Wright from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, and I wouldn't want to preempt my colleague on the same question, but linked to that, when my own board met in Abuja last year, they made a very strong point that, as well as the localizing of the SDGs, which I hope Helen will address a little bit more, and I'm very pleased you mentioned the bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach to implementing the targets. As well as that, you've got to see a move towards localizing resources as well as localizing the SDGs, and is this something that's conceivably possible in the context of Addis and so forth?
Thank you very much. One here.
Dan Pimlott, Adam Smith International. In order to achieve the SDGs, it's about the commitments that governments make, but it's also about the quality of implementation by donors and by other implementers. In the 2011 multilateral aid review that the UK government did, 4 of the 5 sort of lowest performing agencies were UN agencies that described as providing poor value for money. I just wondered if we could have your thoughts on how the UN system should be. I mean, obviously UNDP wasn't part of that; it received a good value for money indicator. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how the UN system can reform the way it delivers development assistance so that it can help to meet the SDGs going forward.
Thank you. Mary, would you mind? I want to take a few more questions because this is probably going to be the last round. So I'm going to go right to the back over there, and then there.
Hannah Alder, I'm at the Overseas Development Institute. You were talking before about a transformational agenda. I'd be really interested to have your thoughts on the gender agenda in the post-2015 framework. Obviously, one of the big criticisms of the original framework was that the focus was very much on outcomes and not at getting at the root causes of gender inequality. So it would be good to have your views on what success might look like and how we measure that.
Hannah, and then right at the back.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Helen. My name is Eliza. I work at The Guardian. I cover the Global Development Professionals Network. Someone else already brilliantly asked a question about the UN being fit for purpose, so I'm interested to hear that. But my specific question to you is, when we met and spoke, you were telling me how excited you were about the My World survey and how many people around the world, and it's 7 million or whatever the numbers are now. Who is going to go back and tell those people what has been decided? How do we engage those 7 million and the rest of the world's population in the decisions that are being made and in the follow-up from that?
And right in the front here.
Hi, my name is Priyanath. I'm from VSO. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for your bringing in the soft means of implementation. And to add to that list, I'd like to also let us not forget volunteers and volunteerism as a means of implementation was really important in the MDGs and will continue to be, but they're not cost-free, and therefore we can't divorce that when we talk about financing. But my question, again, is similar to Hannah. When we talk about gender equality in this framework, a lot of the time what we end up doing is arguing for no regression rather than perhaps transformation and tackling the social norms and the inherent attitudes that stop gender equality from being realised. So I wonder, in light of the Secretary General's report, especially recently, which in some instances took the language a little bit further backwards in terms of women as a vulnerable group rather than the more transformative way that was talked about under the Open Working Group proposal. So I just wondered your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So I was hoping to smuggle a question myself. I think I'm out of time. It'll teach me to chair more strictly in future. So Mary, I think there's two questions on gender there, which I know is an issue very close to your heart, and then one on reporting back to the 7 million, as it were, or the My World survey. Then a question from Dan on the performance of the UN system.
Right. Well, starting with Commonwealth Local Government Forums, Carl and I have had a chance to talk earlier. And local government is a bit disappointed that there's not more specific references, if you like, to the critical role. I think in Goal 16, where it's talking about the need for participatory, responsive, honest, non-corrupt government, etc., it talks about at every level. So at every level means at every level. And I think that's a good hook. I mean, by all means, keep advocating, perhaps for spelling out every level, local, national, global. But I think we've got the hooks to use for local government. But very interesting point raised about whether this can also be recognised in the Addis outcome. And all of us familiar with local government know that they often it often exists in a twilight zone where central government won't give it fundraising powers but won't give it enough central funding either. So it's betwixt and between as subsidiary government, subnational government. So I think it would be good to get a reference into Addis about adequate resources for local government to do their job. The question around from Adam Smith Institute around the UN organisations, yes, DFID's first cut was didn't find merit in several agencies, and they then voted with their feet. Stopped, in some cases I think actually dropped funding altogether or reduced. My view is, and it sort of plays into one of the other questions, perhaps Eliza's, is that, I mean, the UN has a lot of agencies. The trouble is no single force is empowered to do anything about that. Once an agency becomes a specialised agency with its own member state composition and so on, and particularly then the country that has the capital of it, it's almost mission impossible to put things out of business, right? UN's international community is much better at setting things up than closing them down. And I don't know how this would ever be tackled other than perhaps one of the methods of a high-level panel which took a look at the whole lot and then made recommendations to member states. Could we try and get more coherence? It might be a life's work. But meanwhile, having to be practical in the UN Development Group, our job is to try and at least get what we have to work better together. And for me, I am on a crusade to say to agencies, stop focusing on representational presence in developing countries, focus on substance. That for the Sustainable Development Agenda we're going to need in our development framework agreements with government to prioritise the key things where we can add value, and then we're going to need substance. We're going to need substance in that capital, in the UN country team. So not a rep and a flag and a driver and everything else, but substance. If the issue is state of the art on disaster risk reduction, which agencies can send us the expertise that can help develop that. So that's really more performance, content, results, impact oriented is where we need to be driving our system on that. On the ODI question about a more transformational outcome for women, if you think back to the MDGs, the targets were quite limited, weren't they? There was women in parliament or national legislatures, and there was the gender parity in schooling, and then maternal health with its own goal. I mean, I think to be transformational, we really need to be targeting discrimination rooted in the law of the land. And, actually quite a lot of countries still have on the statute books discriminatory laws, so I think that needs to be targeted. And, while, cynics may say, laws don't change behaviour, yes, they do over time. Over time they do, if they're enforced. They have to be enforced. I mean, I'm thinking as I say this, female genital mutilation was outlawed in Egypt, and the first case after a number of years just went to court and was settled out of court, and the case was discharged because even though a girl died, there was a settlement between the person who performed the ghastly procedure and the family. And yet it was a criminal offence under the law, and you can't, as my understanding, settle criminal offences out of court. So, yes, better laws, enforcement of laws, that requires leadership, commitment, etc., and requires all of us who work in these spaces to support the advocates on the ground in country to help drive through those changes. Now, great question from Guardian Professional Network around what about the 7 million people who had a say? And one of the messages that has come through from all the consultations is people didn't just want a one-off say, they want to stay engaged. And all of you are part of that, and reporting back to your constituencies and keeping people informed and informed about how they can then make input, monitor, be part of the process going on in their own countries. The civil society has stayed very close to the negotiations. They're member state negotiations, but civil society, if it's not in the room, is outside the door, and it's very active. And we need to keep that spirit going, that you know, it wasn't just, well, tell us what you think, and then we'll, you know, we the member states will go away and write whatever we think. No, people want to stay engaged. They want accountability. So I think there is momentum around that. And totally agree on volunteers. Definitely soft means of implementation. Without volunteers, societies stop generally, and it's not cost-free. And I've probably covered the kind of social norms, gender transformation issues. I mean, we need law change, but we need follow-through and leadership.
Helen, thank you so much for that. I mean, just the question I would have asked if there'd been a bit more time would have been that, you know, that I think from a lot of the questions and the way you very powerfully framed your argument, that, you know, one of the huge challenges that we've got looking ahead is how do we start reaching people who are being left behind, you know, not just in economic growth, but in opportunities for health and education. And we're clearly not going to do it in the current political framework and the current, you know, framework for economic policy. And I've often wondered why it is, given the centrality of that issue, that, you know, we know if we can't close these huge gaps in opportunity based on region, on wealth, we're not going to get there. And yet actually the current targets, you know, which you could have targets like, let's halve the death rate gap between the richest and the poorest, the school attendance gap between boys and girls in 3 years, 4 years. And it would serve as a real focal point for civil society, for government ambition. And I guess the question I would have asked is, are we missing a trick and maybe letting governments off the hook by not framing something that's a little bit tougher?
Something more quantitative. I agree, because if you just say significantly reduce, well, what does that mean?
Yeah, but something like halve the gaps or whatever. However, I didn't get time to ask the question, so. But it does seem to me, in answering the question, that, you know, that part of, you know, that the work that, you know, Rob is leading in Chatham House and Lenny here and Lenny and others here, you know, this is about progressive universalism. Actually, it's about what you're doing in New Zealand. It's about, you know, how do you roll out a universal system that targets the poor and the most marginalised first. And I think that's what's happened in Indonesia to some extent. The last point I want to make, and I think you alluded to this very strongly, is that in a way the generational challenge for us is, how do you go to zero poverty and zero emissions, or, you know, in the direction of zero emissions in a generation? And actually Tom Mitchell and his team are doing a lot of work on this and led I think really exciting workshop in which Helen spoke at. But you know, but I think that question on the zero emissions side, that, you know, aid has some small role to play, but this is about creating the incentives, the carbon pricing, the getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies that are actually incentivizing investment into carbon that we can't burn. You know, tax breaks for North Sea oil, for exploiting Arctic oil, and this sort of stuff. So, you know, and there's some tough politics around that. And but let me just conclude by first of all thanking the audience for great questions, actually. And it's, you don't always get really energetic engagement, but we did today, and I think it's, you know, thanks to you, Helen, as well. And also to say a huge thank you to you, you know, both for the great work you're doing as a leader in this process, but also for the presentation and for engaging so enthusiastically. So thank you to everybody. Thanks, Helen. That was